and that's you will not go ahead and have to take off challah for such a thing. The ikedi amri, and others say this is lechem ha'osui lekutach. If it's bread that's made for the kutach, what does it mean? What does it mean? It's made for the. What does it mean that it's made for the kutach? The kutach is like it's a dairy. Kutach is a dairy dip, and the kutach is you take sour milk that, let's say, spoiled, that's sour, and you take salt, and you take pieces of old bread, and you go ahead and you mix that all together, and it has a certain taste. It's a certain sharp taste, because you have sour milk, and therefore, and some people used to like to use this as a dip. They would dip certain foods into this dairy, just like we have all these type of dips. And this dip was made from bread that was moldy. So lechem ha'osu lekutach. So the bread that's made for the kutach, so that bread, they used to bake that bread in the oven, in the sun. It was not the normal bread that you put into the oven. How did they bake that bread? They would take flour, they would take water, and instead of putting into an oven to form a nice bread, they would hang it, put it out in the middle of the day when the sun is very strong. Let's say from 11 to 3, the sun is very strong, and that's how they heated up this this flour and water. And then they were going to use this after it was heated up from the flour and the water, and they would leave it that it should get moldy, and then they would go ahead and they would make this dip with it. So that's not the normal bread. Normal bread is not made with the sun. And that's not the bread that the Torah obligates you to go ahead and take off challah. That's not the normal type of baking process. And therefore, you do not need to go ahead and take off challah from such a type of dough. That's not the normal type of dough. That's the fact that it's going to be baked through the sun. Okay? So therefore, the Gemara says that's not required to take off challah. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Vatanya. We learned in the Braita, chayav b'challah. We learned in the Braita that if you make such a bread in the sun, you would be chayav b'challah. You would have to take off challah on such a bread. You just told me that if you just told me that if you bake the bread using the heat of the sun, today we have all different forms of heat, right? So, just like, so if there's discussion in the Gemara in Shabbat, is cooking with a fire. What about if you cook an egg in the sun on Shabbat? What's the halacha, right? So here we're talking about cooking. Here we're talking about baking. We're using the sun as the source of the heat. So the Gemara says we have two different places. One place says you chayav, you have to take off challah for such a thing, and one says that you do not have to take off challah for such a thing that was going to be baked in the sun. So
Rabbi,
answers. What do you want to say?
Is taking the challah based on what is based on the way you're cooking it?
So from here we see from the Gemara that if your intentions were to make it into, if you intended to go ahead and bake it not in the normal fashion, it has to do with, it would affect the way you're going to make it, the way what you plan on doing with the dough. It seems that will have an effect in whether you're obligated to take off challah. So since you plan on not baking it in the normal fashion, So that plays a role. How you plan on using it, that's what we see from here. We have to see more of the halachot of challah to know all the all the details, but that's what we see from here. The way you're going to make the challah will play a role. Whether what you plan on doing with it will play a role, or how you baking it. The source of heat, the Gemara is saying would make a difference in whether you chayav and challah on that. So the Gemara says, Hasam kedektani taima. The Gemara says it depends how you made it. Meaning to say, did you make it thick, like a roll, like a bread roll, or did you make it very flat type of bread? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Masel Mochichan Aleha. The way you made it will show what it is. Meaning to say, Ason Ka'avim, now on Lamed Chet Amar Aleph, 38a. If you
Rabbi,
make it in the shape of a bread roll, so then they are chayav. Then they are chayav to take off challah if you made it very thick. But if you made it kilimudim, if you made it very thin, so then you're patur. Now, what's the reason for that? So Rashi says that if you made the dough in a thick way, so therefore it shows you that you really were intending to make it like a normal bread. A normal bread has some thickness to it. But if you made it in the shape like a simple, like a flat type of thing, that's not the normal way of making bread. And therefore you showed that you are not interested in making it in the normal way of bread. Now, the way the commentaries explain is the following. Some want to say that if any bread that's not baked by the heat of an oven or in a pan without liquid, anytime you're going to go ahead and bake in the sun, you will not, on a Torah level, the Torah never obligates taking off challah, separating challah from a dough that you plan on baking in the sun. So it addresses Michael's point. The way you plan on heating, if the source is the sun, it's not the normal source of an oven, or it's not a normal source of a pan without, let's say if you have a pan without any liquid, a pan without any liquid is similar to an oven, right? If you go ahead and you put if you stick a fire under a pan and you put the dough in that pan, it also, and you didn't put any oil or anything, that also would obligate you to go ahead and take off challah. But if the dough is baked in the sun, that type of bread is not the bread. It's not the normal type of bread. That's not the way you bake bread. You're making bread and it's artificial bread. Is that a good way to refer to it, Gaivad? It's artificial bread. It's not normal bread. It's
Rabbi,
not normal. What? Yes.
if somebody makes bread, it makes challah, let's say, and they don't take challah out, they don't burn it, are they still allowed to eat it or no? Someone's still allowed to eat it?
You still have to separate. You're allowed to eat it. It's a good, but they still have to separate. If they,
Let's say someone puts challah on your table and you know that it wasn't separate, nothing was separated from it.
so
Are you allowed?
So I would have to take out the Yalkut Yosef to see what he says if you're allowed to eat it or not. Won't be the halacha. That's a good question.
Maybe you could take just some off of your piece and put it to the side.
What do you say?
Maybe you could take some.
I would say if the person didn't take off challah, so you should take that piece and have him take a piece of that.
Yeah.
And see, the question is on Shabbat. We don't separate challah on Shabbat, right? We separate the challah during the week. But
Yeah.
I would say most probably you would leave a piece. I would think you would leave a piece of the bread over, and then after Shabbat you would separate a piece from that for challah. See what I'm saying? Meaning,
sure.
usually they separate the challah before they bake. Okay.
Mhm.
If they didn't separate the challah before they baked, and it was already baked, then you still separate the challah.
Okay.
So I would say most probably, if it's a weekday, then you would take off a piece and you would put it away for challah, and it would be for challah. And if it's not a weekday, I would say most probably you take a piece, but you don't separate it yet, but you have in mind of separating it later, after Shabbat. That's what I would say offhand, but I don't have the Yalkut Yosef on me to double check that, okay? We have to double check that.
Okay, thank you.
Your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
But we have to double check if that, the accuracy of what I just said. So the Gemara says, but see, some want to say that this obligation to take off challah from this bread that was made in the sun, the Rabbanan say, if you make it that it looks like a regular bread, it's artificial bread. Artificial bread looks like bread. Because it looks like bread, the Chachamim said you have to separate challah. Only something that looks like bread. But if you made it not thick, you made it very flat, that's not considered, you will not be chayav to take off challah from that type of food that was baked in the sun, and it has two negatives, so to speak. It was baked in the sun, so there's no obligation on the Torah level, and it doesn't look like bread if it's very flat. It has no thickness to it. So therefore, there won't be any obligation of taking off challah in such a food. A lot of times the Chachamim are trying to protect us, and they're concerned that if something looks like bread, even though it wasn't made in the way to be obligated, we have to separate challah. Now, the Rabbeinu Tam, he holds, even if you bake it in the sun, as long as it looks like bread, it still will be obligated on a Torah level. He holds that the way you bake it, the source of the heat, would not exempt you from a Torah from taking off challah. So if you bake this dough, this bread in the sun, that's how you made it. As long as it looks like bread, and he said it would be considered challah. And the reason why over here, if it's made flat, it was not made to be eaten as bread. So if it's not made to eaten as bread, therefore you don't have to take off challah if it's flat. But if it's made to be eaten as bread, it's thick, meaning the thing that they used for the kutach, for the dip, was the type of bread that they made in the sun that was not made with a thickness. It was made very thin, very flat, and was not made to eaten as bread. It was only made and manufactured to be used as part of a dip. And therefore, it does not have the status of normal bread. And therefore, you don't have to separate challah. But if you made this roll with this artificial heat, you went ahead and you made it in the sun. Similar, today, let's say you have electric. If you use some sort of electric source, right? You don't use an oven, but you made it the heat, that's considered, you would be chayav to separate challah. If it looks like challah and it's made to be eaten as a roll. So even though it does not have the normal source of heat, but it looks like challah, it looks like bread, it's eaten like bread. So therefore you would be chayav to take off challah, to separate challah on such a thing. The Gemara says, Amalei Abaye Rabbi Yosef. Abaye says to Rabbi Yosef, Hai kuva da'ara. The kuva da'ara we mentioned earlier. The kuva da'ara is that they would make on the bottom of they would cut out
Rabbi, Hello?
Rabbi, something happened. I think we can't hear you.
Yeah. Rabbi, can you hear us? We cannot hear you also. Maybe let's disconnect and reconnect.
Rabbi?
Now or not?
Oh yeah. He's coming back. He's coming
One
back.
second, Morris Franco's calling. Morris, what's happened? I'm muted?
No, you're
I
good
don't
now,
know. It
Rabbi. We
says-
can hear you now.
It says
Now
I
we can
am
hear you.
not, I don't hear Guy Vad. It says mute. It doesn't.
You're muted, Rabbi.
I'm
Rabbi,
muted.
now we
Let
can
me
hear
see
you.
what's
Now we can hear you.
Now it's good.
Unmute. Maybe I gotta call Nissan and put it on. I'm still muted, right? Automatically.
No,
One
no,
second.
Rabbi,
Let
you're
me-
good.
let
You're
me-
good. Rabbi, good.
Okay,
It's
let me
working,
see.
Rabbi. It's working.
Let me see why I'm muted.
He doesn't hear us.
He doesn't
Rabbi,
hear.
it's good. It's good. It's good. It's good, Rabbi.
It works.
Take Nissan. I think Nissan is trying to fix the issue with the mute.
Hey, Rabbi.
How are you, Nissan? You see I'm muted for some reason?
No, I unmuted you and still I couldn't hear you. You see the mute? I don't know what the issue is. Let's see. I'll tell you what.
Rabbi, we
Yeah,
could
we're
hear
going
you
to-
now.
Can you hear us, guys?
I don't hear the guys. I don't hear them. Okay.
Can you hear us?
No, Morris, hello? Nissan,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yes, you hear us,
Automatically,
everybody?
it just muted, right? Should I,
Yeah.
should
So
I,
I'm hearing you through the. Wait, hold on a second.
Rabbi,
let's
we
see.
can hear you. We can hear you now, Rabbi.
It's right. He said it.
Now you're muted. Now we can hear
You're
you. We
muted,
can hear you.
Chris. 1 second. I'm still muted.
No.
Do you
it's
hear
good,
me?
it's good. Yeah.
Do you hear me? Can you hear
I don't
me?
hear
But you hear me, but I don't hear you. It's a one-way street now. I don't like one-way streets. I like two-way streets. Okay. At least they hear me, right?
Okay, 1 second.
Okay. We have our technician working on it.
They're working on their volume?
Okay. Do you hear me, right? Gavad, okay, very good. We'll continue in the Gemara. So the Gemara says the following. I hope I'll be able to hear you guys. Forgive me if I don't hear you. I'm sorry. So, by the way, you have the chat. If you ever want to write into the chat, if I can't hear you, you could always write into the chat. All right? So the Gemara says,
Can you hear us
Amalei
now, Rabbi?
Abaye leRabbi Yosef. Abaye says to Rabbi Yosef, Hi Kuva da'ara. This Kuva da'ara that we said before, right? It's not the normal bread. It's not the normal dough that you take flour and water and you knead it to make it to a nice dough. Here he just took some flour, and took some water, and you poured it into this cavity, this hole that was inside the oven, and it formed a dough. My mivarchin aleha. The Gemara says, what bracha do you make on this? Is this the normal hamotzi lechem min haaretz? Or do we say that since it's so soft, you would go ahead and say, it's such a wet batter. It's not the normal dry type of, the way they made it. It's not the normal dry dough. So the Gemara is, and it's so extremely soft. So the Gemara says, what's the bracha that you make on it? So the Gemara says, Amalei, mi savret nahamahu. Do you really think it's like regular bread? Guvlo ba'almahu. It's not the regular bread. It is more like a pastry. It's more like a pastry eaten like a snack. And And
Right,
you still have to take off challah, like we take off challah on pastries, but you will not say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. The bracha will be the proper bracha is hamotzi is borei minei mizonot. That's what he wants to say. It's very soft. It's much different than regular normal bread dough, and therefore the proper bracha is mizonot. That's what he says. Ma Zutra kavas sudosa aleha. Ma Zutra made a meal over this kuva de'ara, this flour and water that was poured into the wall of the on the bottom of this oven. And he went, and it was, like we said, it's more like a pastry type of dough. And he went ahead and he made but what did he do? He had a meal. He didn't just have a little as a snack. He had a meal. Now, if you have a meal out of this, so even though something that people generally eat as a snack, but now that you made a meal out of it, it's like a guy takes cake. Cake is usually more like a snack. But if you make a meal out of the cake, what are you having for lunch? I'm having cake for lunch today. That's my lunch. And I'm going to have a whole box of cake or whatever it is. I have a lot of cake. I'm going to have 8 ounces of cake, all right, according to the way the Yalkut Yosef writes, right? If you have 8 ounces of cake, right, 4 eggs of cake, you have to go ahead. And if you're having a meal, you have to go ahead and say, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. So Mazutra, he made a meal out of it. Ubaruch aleh hamotzi lechem min haaretz ushalosh brachot, and he said birkat hamazon afterwards. And Omar Ma Baravashi says, "V'odem yotzei behen yidei chavoto b'Pesach." You can fulfill your obligation of matzah on Pesach if you go ahead and you make this into a meal, and you eat this. You're eating this as the mitzvah of matzah. You want to make this as your sudah. You want to have your meal over this. You go ahead and you can fulfill the mitzvah. My timeout. You didn't mix it with eggs. It's flour and water. It's poor man's bread. Lechem oni, Karina Bey. We call this lechem oni. It's poor man's bread. And since it's lechem oni, so therefore you could go ahead and what? And fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. Egg matzah, you can't do the mitzvah of matzah the night of Pesach with egg matzah because it's rich man's bread. The flour and the water you have the eggs in it. It sweetens it up. It's a rich man's bread, has that flavor. It's not a poor man's bread, egg matzah. Therefore, you can't fulfill your mitzvah of matzah Pesach. But you can fulfill your mitzvah of matzah Pesach with this type of bread that you made by pouring. If you made a meal over this bread that you poured into the flour and the water, you poured into the hole that's on the bottom of the oven, and it formed the bread. So that's what the Gemara says. Now, in the Yalkut Yosef, in Simen Kuf Sameches, he says the following. He says, if a person was kovea sudah, you made a meal over let's say apple cake or different types of things, that bread that's filled with other types of fruit inside the bread, and you made you said, I'm going to make a meal out of this. Generally, you would make a mezonot, let's say, on this cake or on this food. But now you want to have a meal out of this food. You will kaveh sudah on this bread, on this cake or this type of cake. He talks. Let's say you have something. For instance, I'm going to have frankfurter. Those little frankfurters. I'm going to make a meal out of all those frankfurter. They come with the dough on the outside, and I'm going to have the dough, and I'm going to have the frankfurt in the middle, and however they make it, I'm going to make a meal out of that, or any of those type of things that with the dough and the food that's inside it, and it's let's say, You see, he says, let's see some of the examples that he gives. He says, certain things that you eat that has that little dough around it, and you put something inside of it, and it's and sometimes it's not real, that you would make a mizonot, but if you can have a meal out of it, right? We say you're gonna say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. So he said how much you have to eat in order for you to go ahead and say hamotzi lechem min haaretz on those items. So he says if you had a mind to eat more than 216 grams, because what's called kaveh suda, if you have a size of 4 eggs, and an egg is 2 kazaitim, each kazayit is, let's say, 27 grams is a kazayit. So if you have 8 ounces, that's like 4 eggs. So if you have 8 ounces of that food, if a guy would have 8 ounces of cake, I'm going to have 8 ounces of cake. That would be an example. You would have to go ahead and you would say, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. You would wash your hands and so on and so forth. So that if you made it into a meal. If you made it into a meal, your kaveh suda, and you had a nice amount of it. You had that amount. You had 4 eggs, 4 beitzim of this item. You would go ahead and you would say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. So the Gemara says, so that's the story over here. He went ahead and he was kaveh suda. He was kaveh suda on this food. So that's generally eaten as a snack. But since he was kaveh suda, he made it into a meal. He has to say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. See, he says the Sfardim, the Bnei Elus HaMizrach, the Yalkut Yosef says, "Good morning, Yosef HaTzadik. I can't hear you. It's a one-way street over here. You could chat in, you could type in. I can't hear you. There's a problem with the computer here." He says, the Sfardim, they say a matzah after Pesach, they say a borei minei mezonot. And then they say ala michya. But if somebody wants to say on matzah hamotzi, and he wants to say birkat hamazon, when he's kovea suda on the matzah, he's having it like, instead of having challah, he's having matzah. Instead of having bread, he's having matzah, and he's using matzah not as a snack. He's using matzah like the way you use bread. So he says, if a person wants to say hamotzi on the matzah, even though he's not eating 8 ounces of the matzah, even though he's not eating, like we said before, cake or other types of foods that you would make a mezonot, that type of food, that let's say the cake, that you would go ahead and we said you would make, it's baked, right? Since you bake, it's baked, cake is baked. If you go ahead and you would go ahead and you want to make a meal out of cake, you would have to wash if you have 8 ounces of the cake. Something like that, according to the Yalkut Yosef. But if it's not cake, if it's matzah, if a person wants to conduct himself to wash on matzah, he has the right, even though he doesn't have 8 ounces of matzah, he has 1 ounce of matzah, 2 ounces of matzah. He has a right to be noheg, to do that. Since matzah is made to eat with other foods, it's not similar to other types of things like cake that's coming as dessert. Matzah is made more, people eat matzah, and I have my fish, you have matzah, you have your chicken after you have the matzah. It's not coming at the end of the meal. It's coming as a basic food of a meal. So he says, you have a right to go ahead and make hamotzi if you want. He says the Hasidim and Anshe Maaseh, they eat matzah they eat it in a meal that they had actual bread. Then they will go ahead, meaning they're careful not to eat matzah unless either they they had real bread at the meal, then they'll eat the matzah, or they'll actually make a meal out of the matzah. They'll have 8 ounces of the matzah. It's a lot of matzah. And then they'll say, I'm motzi on the matzah and birkat hamazon, because they didn't want to get into the question of what's the proper bracha on matzah. If I'm having matzah, they wanted to avoid this issue, because we know the Ashkenazim will say hamotzi on matzah the whole year round. So that's a little bit, and he says, interesting,
Rabbi,
a person who doesn't eat bread at all because of health reasons, he only eats matzah, he should say hamotzi and birkat hamazon on the matzah.
Rabbi,
And he, now,
He can't hear. There's an issue
that's
with
a little bit, like, you want to chat in, you want to write in a little bit, what you're saying, Gavad? What do you want to say? You could chat into the group so I could look at it? What's in the chat? Let me read the chat. Let's see what it says if it shows up. You want to text it to my phone. I can read it on my text on my phone.
I said I have time. I know, and now I'm doing this to watch you, so I know.
Now, one more thing that he says in the Yalkut Yosef, that which we say if you make a meal over a cake and you say birkat hamazon, that's only if it was baked in the oven, the Yalkut Yosef says. But if you have dough that was cooked or fried, that's not called bread. If the way you made it was you cooked or you fried, it's not called bread. Even if you kovea suda on it, you would make a mezonot and ala michya. So therefore, it's very important to know how they made this type of pastry, how they made it. Is it baked, or is it fried, or is it cooked? So Claire, remember, if it was baked, if it was cooked or fried, then fried in oil and that type of stuff, you will go ahead and it's not called bread. You will not, even doesn't make a difference how much you eat of it. We have to really find out how they make things over here. But if it's cooked, but if it's baked, like a cake or that type of stuff, if you're kovea suda, no, it depends on the mezonot. That's what he's saying. Let's say you have pasta. You will not make. It doesn't make a difference how much pasta. You will not say birkat hamazon, right? Because pasta is cooked. Now, can a sweet challah be used for Suda Shabbat? So that's different. So Ashkenazim would say we use it as a meal. We would say hamotzi on a sweet challah. The Sfardim, they get it. That's where they get into the question, because the Sfardim might look at it that if it's sweet, that it's more like a cake, and therefore they stay away from using, let's say, egg challah on Shabbat. What I recall that he does say somewhere that if you go ahead and if you kovea suda on it, pasta is ala michya, correct. Pasta is ala michya. Pasta is from the 5 grains to make ala michya. But egg challah, the Sfardim would generally make I would think they would make a mezonot on egg challah. But definitely, if they have 8 ounces of the egg challah, they would have to make. They would say hamutzi on it. But that's a lot of challah. That's a lot of challah to eat. But I think he does. See, he talks. We have, he's going to talk about the egg chalas. Maybe we'll find it another time. Let's see if we find it now over here. He says, sometimes they bring, in Sudat Mitzvah, they bring challah. Pasta, you have to have 1 ounce of pasta as a kazayit. But you'll never say hamotzi on pasta. Pasta is made, it's cooked. How do you make pasta? You cook it in water on a fire. It's not baked. It's not baked. You'll know. 8 ounces of pasta, you'll never say hamotzi on pasta. Is that clear? Kavad, is it clear? You will not say hamotzi on pasta. Because pasta, that's what the Yalkut Yosef says. It's not baked. No hamotzi on pasta. Is that clear? Al pasta, you say mezonot, say al mechia. Now this Ashkenazim, they look at egg challah, they say hamotzi on egg challah. Sfardim avoid, they stay away from it. You see, that's, I would think, let's see if he talks about your case about he should definitely talk about the egg challah, but here he was talking about bread that was made with sugar. They tell the people that you only have to make a mezonot. So he says you need to be aware if they have 8 ounces of this bread, then you're kovei sudah, and you have to say hamotzi on this bread. But I'll have to see if he talks about okay, we have to see more because I remember seeing somewhere that he talks about the egg challah somewhere, but I would believe that he would consider that better. He would say that's why the Sfardim are very careful on Shabbat. They don't have the sweet challah on Shabbat. They try to avoid that. The Sfardim try to use water challah. It's called water challah in contrast to egg challah, but they don't want it.
Look how big is the fish. It's 100 years old.
It's more
240 pounds.
More like a pastry. It's more like a snack.
240 pounds. Look how big is it?
What type of fish is 100 years old?
Gaiva, do you hear that? Mike, you hear that? That's where they avoid it. They have
no,
pita,
not this one. The other one
they
there.
have,
What type of fish is that?
they avoid it.
Sturgeon.
It's probably like the.
Oh, I read about sturgeons in my book.
Okay, so I want to thank everybody
by the way,
for
last night I
coming. I'm
watched my
sorry
book
that
on
it's
book
been
3 now.
I couldn't hear you at the end.
You can hear
Thank
me?
you,
I
Rabbi.
wish everyone a great day.
Yeah,
We'll be back
I'm on book
tomorrow.
3
We'll be
now,
live
Abba.
tomorrow, and hopefully we won't have any issue
Abba,
with the computer.
I'm on book 3 now.
Hold on.
Okay, 1 second. What if one said Mizona that cake potential to only have less than 8 ounces? So then he starts to have more. See, that's very similar to the case of the pizza. You see, according to the Chafetz Chaim, it would seem the following. The guy for Ashkenazi who eats pizza, who says I'm mizonot on one slice of pizza, Ashkenazim, Sfardim say hamotzi, but then the fact that he only had 1 slice, he had in mind clearly not to have 2, and if he changes his mind that he wants to have the second, then he has to say a mizonot on the second slice, and then birkat hamazon afterwards, because he ate 2 slices for the Ashkenazim, 2 slices, they would make him say a birkat hamazon. If he plans on eating 2 more slices, meaning he started with 1, I'm only eating 1. I'm not doing until da'im, hamotzi, I'm only eating 1. Then he says, it's so good the pizza, it's added a straw, I'm gonna have 2 more slices, which is generally the amount to have a meal. So then you would have to actually wash until your da'im and hamotzi in that case. That would be for Ashkenazim. The Sfardim, it seems that I saw in the Yalkut Yosef that he says He says, a guy went ahead, he ate cake. This is your case, Gaivad. He ate cake, and he didn't have a mind to have a meal over it. Or he ate some sort of pastry. And then during the meal, he changed his mind. He wants to have a meal over it. He wants to have 8 ounces. He could continue eating based on the mezonot that he had before. That's what the Yalkut Yosef says. I don't think the Chavetz Chaim would agree with that. And he does not need to say Hamotzi now, even though he's eating 8 ounces. But at the end, you have to say. But obviously, you have to say Birkat Hamazon at the end. And this is what the Yalkut Yosef seems to hold. If you planned on only eating less than the amount of a meal, then you change your mind. You can still rely on the mezonot that you ate that you said before. I don't understand. You have to know why you could rely on that mezonot if you clearly did not have a mind to eat more than that. That's why you didn't wash. Why is it good enough that you can rely on that mezonot and you can keep on eating based on the first bracha mezonot, and then you just have to say bracha mozon at the end? That's what I don't understand. That's what he's saying. That's the halacha according to Yalkut for the Sfardim. The Sfardim would say, usually, I presume the Sfardim would follow the Yalkut Yosef. He says, Soma ate a cake. He didn't have a mind to have a sudah. During the meal, he changed his mind. He could continue eating on the bezonot that he said before. He doesn't have to make a new motzi. So that needs clarification. That's the because the Chavetz Chaim I think would hold differently. Okay, and usually, but the Sfardim go with the Yalkut Yosef. So therefore, that should be the law for the Sfardim. But you could ask more about it. All right. I want to wish everyone a great day. Mike, it's great to have you, even though I can't hear your holy voice. Thank you, Ariel, and Morris, and Nisim, and Gaiva. It's great to have you. And where's your friend? Let me see your friend. Is he still there? No. Tell him thank you for being there as long as he was there. We appreciate that he came in, that he joined. All right? Have a great day, everybody. I don't know why I can't hear them. No, not today. Thank you for joining.